Hey guys, Jake here with another review for you. Today we're talking about the MVP Volt. The Volt is a disc that I threw quite a while ago, and the one that I had started to break into a flight that I just really didn't need, and I never really went back to it because I discovered the Tesla, and I thought there's way too much overlap in these two, and just sort of didn't bother. But I did end up picking up one of these bendy volts, the James Conrad Tour Series ones, when they dropped, and started throwing it and have grown to love it again and found that it really doesn't have the overlap I thought it did. So it's sort of re-entered my bag now, and I actually use it quite a bit. So um, I guess let's get into it here. So the Volt is an 8-speed fairway driver. It's got 5 glide, negative .5 turn, and 2 fade. And those numbers are pretty fair. I think when you first buy them, that .5 turn is definitely not a thing. And if you're not throwing into some sort of headwind at all, you might not see the turn. They are pretty stable. And then the fade, I think the fade might be a little generous. I think it's maybe a little less than the 2. But I think it's just the way the fade works, and we'll talk about that. Um, but I do have some footage to go along with this, um, and it'll give me a chance to talk about the different bolts that I was throwing. So we're gonna throw that up here as well while we're going through this. One thing I do want to point out is that the Volt is one disc that I've had a lot of inconsistency in the actual molds that I've gotten. At first, I just realized in the flight some were very, very overstable, some were less stable and actually turned a little bit more. Um, and when I compared them side by side, I noticed that they do have a lot of variation in the parting line height. So it seems that the volts just don't run as consistently as some of the other discs. So that is something to keep in mind is when you buy one, if you don't have a volt already to compare it with, you may be getting sort of a mystery. Not to say that they're not great, the ones that are overstable and understable have their uses, but if you're looking very specifically for a flight, you may have to do a little bit of picking and choosing to find one that flies the same as one that you might already have. Um, so something to keep in mind, and maybe I'm just getting, you know, some of the poor members of the batch as far as consistency go, but I do have like 6 or 7 volts now, and they do all seem to vary pretty evenly across the spectrum as far as where that parting line height is, and they're all of relatively new runs in the same plastic. So um, yeah, that's probably the one thing that I'm less jazzed about with the Volt is just the sort of inconsistency. Um, but when you find ones that fly the way you want to, they're such a nice disc. Anyway, so what I use this disc for actually is pretty much exclusively for headwinds, um, or just shots where I really can't afford to turn the disc over. Um, so it's my main wind fighter. Um, yeah, the Tesla also fills that role, but because of the differences in how they fade, they sort of fill a different slot, and this will not go quite as far as my Tesla's. So the Tesla's a 9-speed, the Volt's an 8-speed. It doesn't seem like it'd be a big difference, but it does. It does when you're talking about throwing into a headwind. The Tesla does seem to cut the wind a bit better, and because of the way it fades, it tends to get a little bit more distance. Um, so let's take a look at a couple of shots here. So to start with, uh, the conditions on the day when I filmed this were pretty windy, 15-mile-an-hour winds, and I didn't really have. I tried to get out and get some shots when there was no wind, so you could see kind of how that works, but there really wasn't. So I decided to go with sort of a crosswind, to kind of hopefully give a better idea. Because in a tailwind, this thing is like a meat hook, and a headwind, it flies very, very straight. So to get something in the middle would have was kind of what I was shooting for. So in this case, we've got a right to left wind about 15 miles an hour. There's maybe a little bit of camera shake here and there from the wind, but hopefully it's not too bad. So to start out, this first disc is this red Volt that I'm holding here. Um, this is one that I won at a tournament recently. Uh, it's maybe got a dozen throws on it total, 173. Um, Pretty much just a standard neutron Volt. Um, so it should give you a pretty good idea of what a fairly standard run Volt should be. Oh, and I should mention it's got sort of the most middle of the road parting line height, I think. Um, so as you can see, it's pretty straight and fades just sort of slowly and gently. And that's sort of the important part is, we're gonna go back and watch that one again real quick. You'll notice that when this thing starts to fade, it starts to fade pretty early. So it doesn't turn over and it just will just sort of almost right out of the hand, it starts to kind of leak a little bit left. And it's more exaggerated with this right to left wind, but as you can see, it just sort of starts creeping left and just slowly fades out. Now, the Tesla, on the other hand, that disc thrown the same way will fly straight for a much longer time, and then it will then dump a lot harder when it does decide to fade. So the end result would be roughly the same location. Like those discs would probably end up exactly the same in this field, but the way they get there is very different. The Volt tends to take a slow, gentle turn the whole time, or fade, I should say, the whole time, whereas a Tesla would be, sort of straight the 90 degrees left at the end. So that's why there's not as much overlap as I expected. These two discs, both great wind fighters and great straight to overstable discs, but the way they fly is different enough that I find I pull them out for different situations. If I'm really shooting down a tunnel and need to cut hard at the end, I would go with a Tesla. Um, Whereas if I'm just trying to throw a straight bomb as hard as I can, you know, it's going to be the Volt because I know it's going to hold up against the wind a lot better, and I can throw it on a little bit of a flex, and since it's so slow to turn, it'll just stay straight that whole time and kind of finish straight. So yeah, you just kind of got to learn to play with the different fade styles. But I think that there is a spot for both of them in a bag if you do like them both. Anyway, so now let's talk. This next disc up here is a Cosmic Neutron. Well, this guy here, I call it bacon salad because it looks like a bunch of bacon strips over some greens. And this one is kind of interesting. I got this one not that long ago either. I was just suddenly on a kick where I wanted to get a bunch of volts after I got my bendy volt, so I just snatched this one off the first site that I saw. And you can see it's got a little bit of a dome, which is weird. None of my other volts, grab the red one. So the red one, I mean, it's not like it's bored flat or anything, but it's not super domey. And I feel like this has come down a little bit. When I first got it, I was surprised at like how much more dome it felt like it had. Um, it doesn't seem to have a massive change in flight because of that, but it was noticeably different. It's got a little bit of a heartbeat to it. So this one tends to fly a little more overstable than average for my volts. So take a look at this guy. Again, sort of starts that fade right away and just holds and holds and holds and holds and doesn't ever really dump any harder. Just kind of keeps slowly working its way left. Um, so yeah, that's pretty much going to be the name of the game here for all of these ones with the right to left wind. There's not a whole lot of variation. So we'll maybe skip through these next few pretty quick. This next Volt is actually one I got at the Composure Pro Shop in the used section. Somebody hand drew this Pikachu. I'm pretty sure. I'm not a Pokemon guy, but my kids have done enough of it that I think I know who that is. But this is an older one. It's got the patent pending on the back. No numbers on it, so the flight numbers aren't there. So it's a little bit older run. It's definitely seen more abuse. This one is way more flat. It's more board flat. So this one is a good example of a neutron after it's kind of taken some abuse and beaten a little bit. This one does tend to turn over a little bit, um, and it does have a slightly lower parting line height. So take a look at this guy. As you can see, it stays straight a lot longer like a Tesla before it starts to fade. But then when it does fade, it's still that same gentle fade. So that's really nice. Next up is bendy. Bendy is the sort of the mold that I use as my standard. This is what I want them all to fly like. This one tends to fly uh, sort of I don't know, slightly above average in stability, or overstability, I guess. Um, it's the one that I know is not going to turn over no matter how hard I throw it. Whereas some of the other ones might start to. Um, and so that's really what I'm looking for in these volts is I want to be able to rip them really, really hard and not worry about them flipping on me. So this has sort of been the gold standard for me. And we can see this one. I think it was kind of a poor throw. I think I throw this one high if I remember right, but yeah, I throw it a bit high. But it has that same sort of starts turning right away or fading right away, sorry, and just kind of cruises out. Next up, another neutron. This was a misprint. This was the first volt that I had that got beat in and became really flippy. It's I don't remember, some tournament somewhere that I never heard of misprint that I found online. Um, but kind of a fun stamp, I thought. It's got the Chris Farley reference. Um, but yeah, this guy is a little bit, definitely more flippy than all the rest of them. So this will be the most understable volt that I have. And again, not a great throw, but as you can see, it holds straight for a long time and then gently fades, sort of like the Pikachu one. And I should point out that was a 172. James is a 171. The Pikachu one, I have no idea what the weight is. The bacon salad one, this guy's 169. And then a 173 on the red one. I try to keep them all around that 170, 171 mark. So they should be pretty consistent overall. Got two left here, but the blue one that we're about to look at is a 173, and then we've got one more after that that is a 169 again. So the weights are all pretty similar, and they're all neutrons. So this is very much not a review to cover all the different plastics, sort of like most of my other reviews tend to be. I don't know why that happened that way. I just happened to buy a bunch of neutron ones. I think because I like the bendy one so much, I was just hunting to find more backups for it. Yeah, so I haven't explored any of the other plastics, which there are quite a few for the Volt. I believe it comes in. They even have an electron Volt, which is interesting. It's the only driver I think they have an electron, but they do have proton, I believe, and plasma, and I'm mostly sure there's a fission. I could be wrong on that one, but um, yeah, unfortunately for this review, you're only gonna get to see the neutron because that happens to be the only one I have, which is a little weird for me, but I don't know, you find one you like and you just kind of stick with it. So anyway, back to the video here. This blue Volt, this one has a little bit lower parting line. I got it actually at the same time as that red neutron one, but this one does tend to fly a little less stable than that guy. Now it does kind of pop up a little bit like it turned over and then has the same sort of slow fade. And the last one, this Volt, uh, this is the one that confused me the most because I got this to replace. So I guess I should say I did have two Volts before I got the bendy one because I bought this one to try to replace the first beat up one I had, only to find that this thing flew more like a fireball or a firebird or something. It is so overstable when I got it. It's another fairly board flat, really high parting line height in comparison to all the others. Almost flies like a different disc, or did. I have thrown it enough now, I used it as like my overstable fairway driver for the longest time. It's now starting to fly more like just a traditionally more overstable volt. So yeah, this one is definitely interesting, and we'll look at the video here, and I'm pretty sure this one fades out pretty hard right away. Yeah, it definitely it's not as intense as it used to be, but yeah, it's pretty much on par with the rest of them now. Okay, so that's all the discs that I've been throwing. Um, And now I want to turn to some video of me throwing into a headwind so you can see more of the scenario where I would choose to throw this disc. So usually if I'm looking to get like 330 to 350 feet of distance into a headwind, this would be a great choice for this. I'd throw either flat or on a slight uh, hyzer for some of the more understable discs. And it should pretty much ride perfectly straight almost all the way to the ground. Whereas if I'm throwing in less wind, I would maybe have to throw these flat to slightly anny to get that straight line. But in this case, the 15-mile-an-hour headwind, I should pretty much be able to throw all these more or less flat, and we can see what they all do. So we'll start with bendy here. This is the one that should stay just the most straight in this headwind, and is just the gold standard. And as you can see, pretty much dead straight and a nice, just barely a little fade at the end. That's exactly what I look for in a volt. That is the perfect line, and that is such a nice shot to have when the wind really gets whipping out there. Um, a lot of people don't have a driver they can trust to fly that straight. Like it flies like a reactor, essentially, like a reactor would in no wind. But it flies further, it cuts through the wind, and it's just that straight with almost no fade at the end. Just a beautiful line. So I really love it for that shot. Next up, we've got the cosmic bacon salad. That one turned a little bit. I think I might have thrown a little bit of Annie with it, but similar line. Here's that super overstable green one. This guy will probably still fade pretty good, even in this headwind, and definitely shouldn't turn over. I threw it out a little bit on a hyzer too. That didn't help any. But yeah, that one still very overstable. This red guy, this one is a little uh, on the more understable side, so I expect this guy to turn over a little. If I throw it flat, that is. And sure enough, it turns just a little bit and flexes back. So that one, that's the one that kind of confused me recently in a tournament. I expected it to fly dead straight, and then I threw it in a headwind, and it ended up cruising off to the right. Same with this blue one. So these two ended up being, I won't say disappointing, but uh, surprising, I guess. So I do have to remember to throw these on a little bit of a hyzer or wait till it's not quite as strong of a headwind. These ones will be really nice for the days when it's either no wind and I need something just a little bit more overstable than say a crave or something. Um, but yeah, they're definitely not the wind fighters that the bendy volt was. So this guy will probably see the same. It should turn a bit. Oop, kind of a poor throw, but yeah, it sort of flipped up. I threw a little bit left and a little bit on a hyzer. Um, so this guy, the Pikachu one, this is again one of the more understable ones that I have in an older run. So this guy will definitely turn over. So that flips up and over from a hyzer even. So that one is not one that I'll be throwing very often. I may throw it in my bag if I lose a crave, because that line right there was very similar to what I would expect from a crave. Um, but it's sort of seen its day in the sun and it's ready to be sort of retired or thrown in a different situation. But I wouldn't use it for what I would normally use a volt for. Same with this disc. This disc will probably be even worse. Um, and I think it was kind of a crappy throw if I remember. I think I threw it a little high. Um, but I threw it on a steep hyzer, I think, to try to mitigate the turn, and it's still turned all the way up and over and basically all the way to the ground. Flexed out at the end there. You can get good distance out of it once they kind of break in, but yeah, that's just not the line I want to get from a volt. So, is there anything else we need to discuss with the volt? I don't think so. This is just a uh, great fairway. Um, it does get okay distance um, for windy situations because there's a lot of discs that will do better in the fairway range, like a crave or even a relay. I can probably get more distance with given no wind or a tailwind. Um, but when you start dealing with heavy headwinds, this is what I'm going to throw when I want to try to get a little bit extra distance and not worry about where the disc is going to go. So it's just a very reliable, trusty fairway. Um, yeah, if you haven't tried one out, I highly recommend picking one up. Um, just keep in mind what I said that you may have slightly different results depending on, I don't know if it's the color or what, because these should all be from relatively new runs. So I'm sort of surprised that the parting lines are so strange. But yeah, just a great disc. And I think if you don't have a straight to overstable disc slotted yet, it's a fantastic choice no matter what. But if you do have one, it's worth considering. Does it fly a little bit different? Like I mentioned with the Tesla, um, if you think it's going to overlap, consider that. Is how does your other straight to overstable disc fly? If it flies more straight with a hard dump at the end, then you might still have room for a bolt. Um, so yeah, great disc. I definitely recommend. And I think next up in the next hopefully couple of days or weeks, depending on how my schedule works out, I'm gonna try to do another review. I'd like to do the Crave next. It's similar to the Volt, sort of slots in between a Volt and a Relay, and then also the Pilot, the Trace, some other discs. So uh, if you want to catch those, go ahead and subscribe. If you have any comments about the Volt or have some other experiences, feel free to leave those. Otherwise, I'll catch you in the next one.